Thank you, Colby, and good evening. Again, I am Christine Kirby. I am the Assistant Commissioner of the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection for the Bureau of Air and Waste. And I'm pleased to welcome you to this stakeholder meeting to continue our process to gather input and to develop proposed regulations for including cumulative impact analyses, referred to CIA throughout this presentation, into certain categories of air quality permits. This is our 6th set of meetings, and we will hold another session. We held another session yesterday, and this is our evening session at 6 p.m. The development of CIA regulations is a priority of the department and also for the Commonwealth. And getting input from all interested parties is also a priority, and we want to make sure that all interested stakeholders with an interest in the regulations we ultimately propose are engaged in this important process. As we have said in previous sessions, we have reached out to the environmental stakeholder community, municipalities, the regulated community, environmental and business organizations, and particularly communities within environmental justice populations and organizations to participate in this process. And again, we're very happy to see you here again tonight. Next slide, please. Since our last session, we've made considerable progress, and tonight we will be presenting an overview and looking for feedback on the draft Cumulative Impact Analysis Framework. This framework will serve as the basis for our proposed regulations. In this session, we will be reviewing the main elements of the framework, including the proposed CIA applicability that will define what permits it covers and what geographic areas it applies to, procedures for pre-application community notice engagement, requirements to describe and analyze existing community conditions, the analytical steps to be included in a cumulative impact analysis in an applicable permit, and finally, the permit and public comment process. Next slide, please. So in terms of where we are, MassDEP started holding monthly stakeholder meetings last August in 2021. And our plan is to propose regulations by this October. We will hold additional meetings on our draft regulations and guidance, and we'll post those meetings on our website when we have those planned. Next slide, please. As you know, the climate law directs MassDEP to incorporate cumulative impact analyses into certain air permits by the end of this year through a public engagement process. We want to note that the climate law also had separate requirements for the Massachusetts Environmental Policy Act, known as MEPA, as shown on this slide. MEPA regulations were amended in December of 2021 to add requirements relative to environmental justice in accordance with the climate legislation. MEPA is moving on to a phase 2 regulatory review effort, which may include refinements to its approach to EJ considerations. And Massachusetts DEP is partnering with MEPA on our CIA work in light of the potential overlap between CIA and the MEPA EJ framework. Information on how to stay involved and apprised of that effort will be provided at the end of this presentation. One last thing I want to note is, as you can see in the draft program framework, MassDEP is anticipating including a program review in the proposed regulations and ultimately in the final regulations. This is consistent with many of MassDEP's other regulatory programs. The current draft CIA framework reflects the first phase of regulations for incorporating CIA in air permits. And important to note, MassDEP is committed to and follows national and state efforts to better develop our programs and also follows the science and research as it evolves. After a program review is completed, a second phase of the regulation could include more detailed requirements to analyze and assess the cumulative impacts of applicable air permits, such as how additional air pollution would affect existing environmental burdens in the community. In closing, For my part, we appreciate your partnership in exploring this very complex topic of including CIA in the air permitting process. Thank you for your participation, and I will now turn it over to Joanne Morin, the Deputy Director of the Air and Climate Division. Joanne?
Thank you, Christine. So as Christine said, my name is Joanne Morin. I'm the Deputy Director of the Air and Climate Division, and I'm going to go over some of the initial step and a few introductory concepts that was in the framework. As you know, we posted these slides on our website, and we also posted a document that gave an overview of the CIA framework. So we encourage you to take a look at that. Hopefully you got a chance to look at that before this meeting, but it is there, and the slides are a description of that framework of what we're planning to do with the cumulative impact analysis. So I wanted to first just describe a few examples of cumulative impact analysis. These concepts have been used in the US and internationally to evaluate large infrastructural projects like highways and mines and dams. For instance, in the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, which is the that's what our Massachusetts NEPA is based on, is uses it for the analysis of cumulative environmental effects of large projects. So for instance, in Minnesota is required by statute to analyze cumulative levels and effects of past and current pollution before a permit may be issued, which includes evaluation of environmental health data, community stressors and vulnerabilities, as well as nearby sources, and modeling results for air toxics and cumulative and criteria pollutants. The permit is still based on compliance with national ambient air quality standards and an air toxics risk assessment. New Jersey passed a 2020 EJ statute and uses a comparative impact approach in certain permit decisions. The law does not specify a cumulative impact analytical method for air emissions specifically, but instead specifies a project impact that causes or contributes to identified stressors in overburdened communities that are higher than those borne by other communities that can lead to denial of a permit. By statute, it's based on a comparison between these different areas of the state. California defines cumulative impacts as exposures, including environmental pollution from all sources and including socioeconomic factors. California uses a scoring rubric, called California Cal EnviroScreen that you may be familiar with. We've brought it up at previous, we've described it at some of our previous meetings, to compare communities and to allocate funding and direct program resources, and are not currently using it to make permitting decisions. So these current examples of cumulative impact analysis have not taken cumulative air emissions from a facility and distinguished or quantified their specific impact on the existing community's air quality or their impact on health-related vulnerabilities, except in a very general sense. EPA recognizes this, and now they are undergoing a research effort to define approaches to address cumulative impacts and risks. MassDEP's proposed approach to cumulative impact analysis in air permitting is to use an analytical approach that will evaluate the potential impacts of a proposed project's air emissions in or near environmental justice populations, while also considering how existing environmental, public health, and socioeconomic stressors affect those community conditions. So at our last meeting, we did show you the slides that depicts the major steps that are envisioned for a cumulative impact analysis. And tonight we are going to describe and go through in more detail, especially these first 3 steps. And that would be the pre-application community notice and engagement, And then the second step where we are assessing the existing community conditions. And the third step, analyzing the impacts of existing and added air pollution. And that's where we're going to spend most of our time tonight. And as I mentioned, this is described in more detail in a document, the actual draft CIA framework that was also posted along with the slides on our website. And the location of that website, we have that. Unmute, start speaking. I just want to make sure I'm unmuted. Okay. I had a notice it said to unmute, so I wanted to make sure I wasn't muted. And we'll have that later in the presentation for your reference. The final four steps, the process steps, we will also review at the end of the presentation. As Christine mentioned, we're also planning that this is the first stage in our regulations, and that we are planning in the regulations to indicate a program review stage, so that as the research on impact analysis, cumulative impact analysis evolves, we can update and also evaluate this process and update it in the future as the research becomes more developed. So in terms of applicability, CIA would be required for a comprehensive plan approval for any new facility in or near environmental justice populations. And this would be within 1 mile for a non-major comprehensive plan approval, or within 5 miles for a major comprehensive plan approval. And I'm just going to skip to the next slide for a moment as a reminder and this was, we went through this in detail at a previous meeting, but as a reminder of what are the thresholds for a non-major comprehensive plan approval. And this would be for a non-major, would be process emissions greater than 10 tons, and then fuel burning or combustion units at certain fuel input thresholds. For instance, this was one of the examples of 40 million BTU per hour of natural gas. So that'd be something like a boiler at a commercial operation, or and then there are specific types of facilities that require a non-major CPA, and that would be like an incinerator, and then non-emergency engines, except for those that are like restricted to a very minimal amount of hours of use, such as ones that are restricted to 100 hours of use. And then major CPAs that have significant amounts of pollution, that these thresholds have to do with Federal Clean Air Act thresholds. So if we go back to this, oops, I'm sorry, wrong direction. We'll go back to applicability. So new facilities that meet those thresholds for non-major CPAs and major CPAs within those distances of EJ populations. And then for an existing facility that already has an approved comprehensive plan approval, that is either requires new equipment or is going to modify its CPA, is going to modify the equipment it already has. And it is increasing its emissions above a de minimis level of a ton per year. Those situations would also require a CIA. So in summary, the applicability is a focus on environmental justice population to acknowledge the importance of protecting EJ populations from added environmental burdens, and that's similar to MEPA's new EJ assessment regulations, as well as increased emissions. Comprehensive plan approvals, or CPAs, are required for those emission sources that pose a greater potential impact on air quality. And we are CPAs that result in emission decrease, like replacing older equipment with new, less polluting equipment, would not require a CIA, because there's really no cumulative impacts to analyze, because the impacts are reduced. Excluding those CPAs would avoid creating a disincentive for beneficial projects that actually decrease emissions. So a modification to existing CPAs that result in de minimis emission increases less than 1 ton per year would not require a CIA. However, MassDEP would reserve the right to require a CIA for those permits on a case-by-case basis. At this time, DEP has existing EJ public involvement plans, so communities are notified of before application of in EJ populations of the intent for facility permit applications. And so under those notifications and those fact sheets, communities are notified of changes. And so depending on the community's interest, we can always reserve the right to require a CIA if it is warranted. So the last area I just want to go over is the pre-application stage. We are proposing at this point 60 days prior to submitting a permit application. The applicant would be required to provide public notice of the project to MassDEP, as well as the MassDEP Environmental Justice Director and the affected EJ population and local officials to seek input on the project. They would be required to submit a fact sheet about the project, and we would be developing, detailed guidance on what that community engagement, what sufficient community engagement would be, how to go about that, and how to engage also with DEP. And we'll be developing that guidance to supplement the regulations. So this would be similar, this pre-application step would be similar to MIPA's new pre-filing EJ community engagement that has been proposed, that has been brought out to the public recently in their recent regulation filings. So I'm going to stop there and see if there are any questions on this for applicability and the first stage of the CIA framework. So if anyone would like to raise their hand or put something in the chat to ask DEP.
And just a friendly reminder to audience members, if you do not want to speak, you can always send myself, Colby Richardson, a message via the chat. I'm more than happy to read it on your behalf, or use the reactions icon to raise your hands. And I'm happy to let you unmute and speak for yourself. So we'll give it about 15 or so more seconds. If you have any questions, more than happy to answer.
And there's going to be a few more opportunities too. So if you think of something at the later points where we stop for questions, you can feel free to ask at that point as well. Okay, oh, we got a question.
Kevin, go ahead.
Hi, maybe just a quick clarifying question. I think on the previous slide or the one before, there was something about meaningful involvement with affected communities. I was just wondering if that's the same, or how you tell which communities are the affected communities. Is it the same definition as one of those slides about 1 to 3 or 1 to 5 miles from EJ population, or what is that definition?
Yes, it would be the same definition that we're saying in terms of applicability. It's those populations that it would be the same definition. Glenn, do you want to add to that at all? Yeah, so yes, you have that correct. Did you see any other questions, Colby? Okay, so
no, I'm not seeing any other question for that question.
All right, so I'm going to move on to Glenn Keith, the Director of the Air and Climate Division is going to continue on. Oh, no, I'm sorry, I am incorrect. Sandy Baird is going to continue on with the next section of our talk.
Oh, hi, good evening. My name is Sandy Baird. I'm the Chief of the Toxicology Group in the Office of Research and Standards. I'm pleased to be here tonight. So, as you know, an important part of a cumulative impact assessment is to understand and describe the communities near the proposed new source. With communities input, the applicant will collect information on a range of characteristics and potential stressors in the community in the areas of environment, health, and socioeconomics. Several indicators will be used for understanding each of these areas. All information will be combined into a report about the existing community conditions. This report will include maps showing the location of the proposed new source, other existing sources, where people live, where they go to school, and other indicators. The report will also include tables with data and a narrative describing the community conditions. Community input into this process is important for identifying local concerns and knowledge about the community. Next slide, please. Thanks, Joanne. At previous meetings, we asked you for your help to identify indicators that should be included in the cumulative impact assessment, and we thank you for your suggestions. Since then, we have continued identifying and evaluating indicators specific to Massachusetts. We also shared our process for evaluating each of these indicators, shown here. Our goals have been to have data that are readily accessible to all people who are interested in cumulative impacts or impacts in their communities, to provide information on a scale for evaluating the community surrounding the proposed source. So we want it to capture that community. We want them to be recent so they reflect current conditions to the extent possible. And we also want to be able to capture specific attributes to help give a clear view of that particular attribute. These indicators can be quantitative or qualitative. In January, we shared that we had evaluated over 80 indicators. Since then, we have continued to evaluate the indicators, leading to the proposed set of indicators describing community pollution burden and community population characteristics and vulnerabilities. Next slide, please. I'm going to take some time to go through and describe the pollution burden indicators. We've grouped those into 3 parts. One, air quality, location of regulated facilities, and climate indicators. The indicators on this slide and the next that have asterisks are those that are under consideration, and in some cases, we are still evaluating the best source for the indicator. The air quality indicators are familiar to those of you who have used US EPA's EJ screen. These indicators are quantitative and available as percentiles of the state of Massachusetts. Just want to point out that the traffic volume and proximity indicator is included because it provides information on potential exposures to traffic-related air pollution, including ultrafine particles. The regulated site proximity indicators will provide a list of facility types whose locations will be identified within the area of the analysis surrounding the proposed new source. The climate-specific indicators will ultimately include in the cumulative impact assessment are still being evaluated. This is the case where we're still looking for a good source for those, but they are important indicators for inclusion. Next slide, please, Joanne. So we've grouped the indicators for characterizing the population and potential vulnerabilities into 3 groups as well. We have the health indicators, the socioeconomic indicators, and indicators that give location of various sensitive populations. Both the socioeconomic indicators as well as the health indicators include those that are part of the environmental justice that are used to used to identify environmental justice in vulnerable health communities that are part of the 2021 EJ policy. We've added to the health indicators, you can see on the bottom there, elementary school asthma prevalence for schools that are within the area of analysis to get a local view. And we are considering adding a measure of premature mortality that will reflect early deaths in the community from chronic diseases such as chronic COPD and cancer. We're also likewise still considering several socioeconomic indicators, including indicators for unemployment and renter-occupied housing. Locations of sensitive receptors are really important when we're evaluating the potential for exposure from a news source. These will be included in the map and the potential for exposure discussed in the CAA report. So to summarize, after evaluating the indicators suggested by you and characteristics and those that are used by other states for similar purposes and characteristics that we considered important to consider in air permitting, we have developed this proposed set of indicators that meet the criteria for inclusion. And that wraps up the indicator section, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Sandra. Again, at this time, if you have any audience questions, we encourage you to raise your virtual hands or send a message via the chat to myself. Give it about 10 more seconds. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions.
Keith will now discuss the next section on conducting the cumulative air quality analysis. Glenn?
Thanks, Sandy. Hi, my name is Glenn Keith. I'm the director of the Division of Air and Climate Programs. And the next section is really getting at the heart of the cumulative impact analysis section. And this slide summarizes that analysis, and then I'll get into some of the details of this. But the air quality, this would be a focus on air quality since we are talking about an air permit, and the analysis would include the cumulative impacts from both the existing and added pollution from the facility through air dispersion modeling, which is something that we do in permits to describe how emissions will affect receptors in the community, as well as evaluation of significant local traffic and transportation emissions. And that would be a new thing because we don't generally look at traffic emissions in a stationary source permitting process. And then the results of that analysis, there would be a comparison to standards, the National Ambient Air Quality Standards for criteria pollutants, and then to risk management criteria for air toxics. And again, that's new because we don't generally do a risk characterization in an air permit process. And then in addition, we would display the modeling results graphically, require that to be done as part of the report to just show in greater detail how the concentrations actually affect the community, because that can be shown, and that would increase transparency. And then the analysis would also include, an overall general description of the effect the project has on the existing community based on the indicators. One important thing to note is that we are considering the use of lower standards, both in terms of air quality standards and risk management criteria that would be applicable to certain EJ populations based on the existing conditions that they have. And this is to be determined. We don't have a specific proposal at this point. The other thing to note in terms of the air toxics that we do evaluate, we're looking at doubling that number. We currently have a list of about 100 And that would, the Office of Research and Standards, Sandy's group is looking at adding, doubling that number. Next slide, please. So for criteria air pollutant dispersion modeling, want to go over that, but before I do, I just wanted to, for some people who aren't familiar with that, basically air dispersion modeling is a tool that's used in the air permit process to predict how proposed emissions from a source will affect air quality. We use EPA's AirMod dispersion model. That's a standard model that's used by all states as well as EPA to support regulatory air permitting. And the model uses emission rates and parameters from the source, such as stack height and so forth, as well as meteorological inputs to predict concentrations of pollutants at downwind receptors around the facility. And generally, this modeling is a worst case analysis in that it uses maximum potential emission rates for each pollutant that's emitted and combines that with, again, meteorological data to calculate the highest concentration that would occur from the emissions. And then that worst case concentration is compared to standards. So if the highest worst case concentration meets the standards, then generally the permit is protective of public health and would be issued. So for criteria pollutants, and these are the 6 pollutants for which EPA has published national ambient air quality standards, such as precursors to ozone, NOx and VOC, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, particulate matter, carbon monoxide, and lead. The actual dispersion modeling would include emissions from the facility, as well as emissions from nearby permitted air sources. And for a lot of projects, this often is done today, so this would be similar. And then include background data from our statewide ambient air monitoring network, and then comparison to the national ambient air quality standards, or potentially lower standards in EJ areas to be determined. So this would be similar for at least the criteria pollutants for what we do today. But as they'll get to, there'll also be evaluation of traffic emissions. Next slide, please. For the air toxics component, and this would be things such as benzene or formaldehyde that's emitted. These are referred to as hazardous air pollutants or air toxics. What we would be doing is moving from what we practice today, which is just looking at the emissions from the facility and then comparing them to risk screening values that we have published called ambient air levels. And then moving that to be more cumulative in nature and doing a cumulative risk characterization. So the air dispersion modeling would include the emissions, all the emissions from the facility, which is done today, and then include emissions from nearby permitted air sources, and that would be new to the extent that that data is available. And then instead of comparing just to the risk screening values on a chemical by chemical basis, there'd be a cumulative analysis of the risk, and that way you could add up the risk across all of the air toxics that have been evaluated. And in the cumulative risk characterization, there would initially be a default assumption. So this would be initial screening of the combined toxics to ensure that they're below a cumulative risk management criteria of 10 in 1 million excess lifetime cancer risk, and a hazard index of 1 for non-cancer chemicals that still could affect people, or again, lower risk management criteria for certain EJ populations. And these risk management criteria are what are used for already in DEP, for instance, in the hazardous waste site cleanup program to determine acceptable cleanup and relative to total site risk characterization, as well as some other programs. If the risks exceed these based on default assumptions, then a more detailed risk characterization could be done where some of the default assumptions are changed, such as the initial screening would assume 70 years of exposure, and but if there's evidence for the facility's only going to be the life of the permit is 40 years, you could assume 40 years of exposure instead. So there are some parameters that could be tailored based on facility-specific circumstances. But this risk characterization process is new. Next slide, please. And then in addition to using the air dispersion modeling, there would be a requirement to conduct evaluation of significant local traffic and transportation emissions. And this is an area that we're still researching and trying to figure out the best method and approach for doing this. There is data available from MassDEP in terms of average daily trips for major road segments. And there are mobile source for transportation related modeling software that includes default assumptions for vehicle mix, in terms of relative mix of cars versus diesel trucks. So there is data available. There's also the data from the US DOT on traffic volume in proximity, which is one of the indicators. And then some of this data is also already modeled on a national level by EPA. There's a national emissions inventory that's used to then model these emissions. So these are some of the sources that are available. However, it's still challenging because on any specific road segment, you don't really know the exact mix. So, could we use some of these defaults, or are there other ways to look at traffic emissions near roadways? So this is an area we're continuing to look into. Next slide, please. And then in addition to the analysis of the air quality specifically relative to the permit, there'd be also an analysis of how the project could potentially affect the community given the existing environmental and health conditions. And so this would be a description of the impact on these conditions based on the indicators that Sandy talked about earlier. And we would imagine this would be a qualitative analysis because it's very difficult. There's not clear methods that exist where you can add up disparate impacts, because if you think about what is a cumulative impact, it's the impact of A plus B plus C equals some number. And right now it's difficult to determine what that would be if you have, a hazardous waste facility. What is the impact on the community, combined with a wastewater treatment plant versus, some of the traffic issues and other facilities that might have an impact on the community, and then combine that with some of the health conditions. So, but we would be requiring an analysis and description of how these emissions could potentially affect the community. And this, in addition, if applicable, if a project has gone through MEPA, then any relevant analyses and findings made during that process would have to be considered as well, including whether in that process it was determined that there was a disproportionate adverse effect from the project, and that would through the MEPA process. Next slide, please. And I'm going to stop there for some questions.
Great, thank you, Glenn. And just a reminder for people who just joined, if you have a question, you can either raise your virtual hands and I'm happy to unmute you so you can say it, or you can send myself, Colby Richardson, a message via the chat, and I'm happy to read it on your behalf. Chris, you have a question. Please go ahead.
Hi, good evening. I just wanted to say to all the folks, appreciate all the work and thought that has gone into this. I work for Eastman Chemical Company, so we are part of the regulated community. And I just have a couple of questions or suggestions. Okay. So the first around the cumulative risk of air toxics, because this is new, will that be incorporated into, I guess, an air toxics modeling guidance on how to conduct that kind of cumulative risk assessment versus cancer risk. And then I guess the other, I'm kind of taking it to a foregone conclusion, but I can't imagine a scenario where the applicant isn't going to kind of sing praises about what the potential impact is going to be. And I could speak for my company, but maybe not others. We'll certainly attempt to be as truthful and accurate in that process. But I suspect that given that it's a qualitative analysis, I'm just curious if, the applicant is of the belief that it is a good project and the, EJ community surrounding the facility is thinking of it as not being for their community. Given that is a qualitative analysis, what is effectively the tiebreaker for whether or not that could be an issued plan approval? Thank you.
Sure. In terms of your first question on the risk characterization, yes, we would provide guidance on how to do that. Under the current air program, there are already through the air dispersion modeling that's generating concentrations of toxics at receptor points, and I think this would just take it to the next step where you would then add up you could determine the risk from each of those and add them together versus comparing them to our current screening levels, which are also for AALs are also already based on cancer risk, but there's not you don't add them across chemicals. So yes, we would provide guidance on that. And then in terms of the description of how the project affects the community, I think we'd provide some guidance for that, but this would have to take into account also the community concerns that were voiced and address those as well. And I think did you have a specific question on it, Chris? Can you remind me if you're still there?
Sorry, I was trying to unmute. Thank you for taking me off of mute there. Yes, the question is obviously that there are going to be valid concerns that get brought up. I'm just curious on with it being a qualitative analysis, is there a certain amount of weighting, for instance, that would be given, say, for instance, to the applicant's perspective versus the community's perspective? What would effectively be the tiebreaker or the rubric that you guys would use on whether or not a plan approval could be issued?
Right. Yeah, I think in general, what this proposal has is that if the air quality analysis shows that you're meeting the ambient standards and the cumulative risk characterization, there's an assumption that public health is protected and the permit could be issued. And it's we weren't really thinking of necessarily having the qualitative action that would be reviewed. But we're still working on how exactly all of this would be synthesized into a permit decision. But at a minimum, by describing the existing community conditions, working with the community and addressing their concerns, because certainly through this process, a facility would demonstrate through the CIA report how they are addressing concerns and how they are addressing impacts through the project, whether it's through design changes, pollution controls, and potentially even mitigation actions. We're hoping that this would lead to increased transparency and with the community and bring some of these issues to the fore so that they're aware of it to make a better project. But in terms of there wouldn't be a hard and fast rule, I think, in terms of this section of the analysis. I know that doesn't fully answer your question, but that's where we are.
And I would just add, we talked about a program review and the science is evolving. EPA, Joanne mentioned EPA's research. So this could be an active conversation when we start working on the program review after we do final regulations.
Great, thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Christine. Cindy has their hand raised. Cindy, please go ahead and unmute.
Hi, everyone. Cindy Loopy with Clean Water Action, New England Director, she, her pronouns. Thank you so much for all the work that has gone into this and, you know, the great community sessions that you've held. I know everyone appreciates very much that there have been both daytime and evening sessions, and know that it is, it's a lot that our environmental agency staff are moving very quickly. So I also want to just share our deep appreciation for the work and the innovative thinking that is moving this discussion forward. I did want to say that we're particularly grateful that the qualitative analysis pieces that you've given us an overview on are included, because for many EJ communities, it's the combined burdens of some of the environmental health conditions plus the socioeconomic health burdens that make this such a critical issue, and that sort of provided the spirit for what passed the legislature this, I guess, was this just January? It seems like it was years ago, but I know it was very recently. I do also want to say that in relation to, you know, the last conversation, that it is our feeling as environmental advocates, as environmental justice leaders, as community leaders representing the hardest hit and most overburdened populations, that frankly, there are some communities for which there should be no added burdens. I'm thinking of places like Roxbury, places like Chelsea, places like Springfield, you know, where the burdens are there, identified, and that, you know, our goal in promoting this policy reform is to make sure that that burden stops getting added to, and, you know, ideally moving forward, that some of the existing burdens are addressed and ameliorated. So it is our input that, you know, there are some communities for which there shouldn't be additional environmental health impacts added from particular facilities. And I think that's even if some of these national ambient standards are being met. So I wanted to flag that concern and say that there are definitely communities for which reduced burdens, you know, facilities that look at mitigation plans, or possibly, you know, slightly different locations, that is the appropriate response. But there are some communities who, quite frankly, cannot afford additional burdens of an environmental health sort. So I wanted to make that point really quite strongly, and urge DEP to think about that as the regulation moves forward. I also think that, you know, we're all figuring out how to do this. We're very cognizant of the fact that this is precedent setting in some ways, although we have, thank heavens, we have New Jersey to look to, and you know, some other innovations in other locations. But for us, the spirit and the letter of these reforms is all about reducing burdens for the hardest hit communities in the state. And you know, I hope we can all keep that in mind. I know that people who have been deep in the process have, and you know, you can really see that heart and that commitment in what's been presented. I just wanted to emphasize that, particularly on behalf of the communities that have high asthma rates, high cancer rates, and other really unacceptable health burdens. So thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. And that's a very good point. And I think, this process, everyone would like to see these burdens decreased. And this process is certainly going to make, any permit applicant more aware of the conditions in the community. And we think it will affect decisions about projects. And, hopefully over time, we would see, reductions of emissions and burdens and only, expansions of emissions where they're needed, where it really is, hopefully outside of burdened areas. So we think this will have an effect on that to address that problem, even though it's challenging and we need additional work to develop, methods for doing this. Thank you.
I'd just like to add to your point, Cindy. We have been working very closely with not only our environmental justice, Deneen Simpson, she's on the phone tonight, but also with the environmental justice director up at EEA. And these are all, your points are very important to us. So we're trying to integrate what you're talking about into this analysis, but we do have some technical challenges and we're trying to work through them, but take to heart your comments. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Lynn, please go ahead and unmute.
Hi, thank you. I have a question about the air dispersion analysis and the difference between criteria pollutants and air toxics. I do see that for criteria pollutants, we can model and see first whether or not we'll have a significant impact and compared to the significant impact levels. And that's sort of, it sort of ends there if the project is insignificant. But for air toxics, it doesn't seem that would be the case. And so I was wondering, does that mean basically that for air toxics, you always have to conduct that cumulative impact with background sources and your existing source? And, the second part of my question is, if the cancer risk is already sort of unacceptable in that area, does that mean that projects would not be, or hazard index projects would not be able to proceed in those areas?
Right. In terms, just on the first part of your question, we are looking at, developing a risk characterization tool. Minnesota has a tool they use, and they plug in, some of the air toxics emissions. They do have there is a screening portion in that. If you're, above a certain level, then you would proceed with, more detailed analysis. So that's a good point in terms of, which are the, contaminants of concern. And then in terms of, currently this process, the air dispersion modeling for air toxics, we don't have good background data. So it's looking at the emissions from the facility as well as other permitted sources. And then, the analysis that we discussed is more qualitative. We would also look at the existing, background, but it's a little different than the criteria pollutant background. So I don't know, Sandy, if you want to add to that, or did I get that right?
Yes, you got that right, Glenn.
Okay,
Thanks.
Sandy's the risk characterization person, expert. I don't know if that answers your question, Lynn, or partly. So.
Yeah, I think so. It sounds like you may be trying to develop sort of a de minimis levels for, I guess, like New Hampshire has de minimis pounds per hour, for example. Do you think you'll try to develop some kind of de minimis number for the air toxics?
Yeah, again, we haven't delved into the details, but I think in
Okay.
a lot of cases, there will be certain air toxics that are the real drivers of risk and some others might be that are at very low levels or very low risk, could be screened out potentially. But
Okay, I guess my question is, what if they're the existing, what if not even including your own facility or, your own change to your facility, there's already a problem. So I guess that just means, I guess that's my question.
Right.
So I guess that hasn't been worked out yet, maybe.
Right, because we don't have background air quality for air toxics. We do have, as you're familiar with EPA's air tox screen, but that has, some uncertainties in the scale. So, I think that issue needs to be further looked at as part of this process.
Yeah, it does
point.
happen. Unfortunately, it happens often in air modeling that you kind of find out, the impacts of another facility and they're high, and with criteria pollutants, you can show that you're not contributing significantly to an exceedance of an AX and still proceed with your project. So, I mean, that's just something to think about for air toxics.
Yeah, and the idea, if it's from a known source with, a nearby permitted source, then, that potentially could be a situation where, you just can't build there if combined, you can't miss the risk management criteria.
Okay.
Or expand or somehow mitigate.
Well, I'm just saying, like, you couldn't mitigate your, I'm just saying, what if it's already over? There's not anything you could do to solve it with your facility.
Right. No, I understand.
That, I mean, that's just an issue that, could be very difficult for businesses. So just suggesting maybe a de minimis modeling threshold or something like that.
Okay. It's a good comment. Thank you.
Great, thank you. At this time, I'm not seeing any chat messages to myself or any additional hands raised.
Okay. So the next step is some of the process steps after the analysis is done. And so the applicant would then put together a permit application with the cumulative impact analysis report and file that with DEP. And what we're proposing is at that same time, MassDEP would notify the affected community of the availability of the application and that it's beginning its review, so that the community could, see the information at the same time that DEP gets it and begin reviewing it, and could ask questions or submit comments to DEP to consider during the review. And this would be just an ongoing informal opportunity to comment. And then after DEP's review, just standard how we do it today, we would issue a proposed permit decision, but we would have a formal 60-day public comment period versus the current standard 30-day comment period to give more time for DEP review, or actually, the community review, since it's not only a permit application, but the cumulative impact analysis report as well. Then after the public comment, issue a final permit decision to approve with conditions or deny the permit. Next slide. And this slide summarizes some of the things that we've covered that are new in the CIA air permit process. How does this differ from today's air quality permit process? So there's this requirement for a pre-application community notice and stakeholder engagement, which doesn't exist today. We have been implementing, as Christine mentioned earlier, at the point of application, outreach and notice to the environmental justice communities and development of a fact sheet. But this would bring this even prior to that, at least 60 days prior to any permit being filed with us, outreach to the community. Then assessment of the existing community conditions using the indicators that Sandy went over. More air toxics would be evaluated, and for which we would develop toxicity information, and these would be put into the risk characterization tools so that all the reference concentrations or other information that's needed is in the tool. And then requiring cumulative air toxics, air dispersion modeling versus single chemical, and then the risk characterization. Those are new components. And then consideration of the significant traffic and transportation emissions, and somehow to integrate into the analysis. And then more detailed air dispersion modeling results, because this would be useful for, to communicate more clearly where the concentrations are from the facility, and are they just near the fence line, or what are they in the actual community? And then description of the potential impacts on the community conditions and possible mitigation actions, which we were just discussing in some detail. The opportunity to comment while DEP is reviewing, and then a longer comment period. So these are some key and significant differences from how air permit is done today under this proposal. Next slide, which I think is questions. Yeah, so are there any questions on, kind of that process piece, or anything really that folks have that weren't raised earlier?
Okay, I'm seeing a number of hands. Mara, why don't you go ahead and please unmute?
Thank you. Could you estimate how many permits you anticipate having to issue once this is in place? Maybe on an annual basis?
Right. In terms of, currently today, annually, in terms of the number of comprehensive plan approvals, it varies by year, but Joanne, I don't know if you have this handy, but I think it's, anywhere between 30 and 40 permits.
Yeah. Right.
Now not a good number of those are, within a mile of an environmental justice community. But so under this proposal, it would be a similar, probably a lower number, because, those that are far away from environmental justice communities wouldn't trigger applicability. But that gives you an idea of how many permits we issue today annually.
Thank you.
Chris, please go ahead and unmute.
Thank you. I did have just two other questions that I wanted to ask, and I was just curious, and again, I understand the details haven't been worked out fully on some of these things, but I did recognize that this will likely mean more staff for MassDEP, and I'm hoping that you all have earmarked a higher budget, perhaps to hire more staff. Additionally, in addition to kind of the additional review burden, I was just curious about whether or not you've got any estimates on how much additional review time this might add to the existing review times that you have for the various permits, both for the non-major and the major comprehensive plan approvals. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Those are good questions. I mean, we are going to have to update our permit fees and timeline reg, which, establishes the timelines that we have for our permits, and to, a longer amount of time. But we haven't come up with a proposal yet on that. And then in terms of staffing, you're right, it's going to take more effort for sure on that.
And do you anticipate those resources would be at the regional level, or would they be in the Boston office?
I think a combination, but primarily the work is done in the regions in terms of the permit review. But, we're going to have to develop, for ourselves, internal, guidance and training for reviewing these types of permits, because this is not something that, our air permit reviewers are familiar with. So it'll be a learning experience to do, and a lot of work will have to go into this for sure.
Agreed. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Kevin, please go ahead and unmute.
Hi again, and thank you for all this work. I forgot to say before. I appreciate how in-depth the analysis steps are here, definitely. And before, I'm a transportation policy analyst with the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I was just wondering about the process a little more. What happens with the analysis after? It is my understanding that cumulative impacts analysis is supposed to be able to account for and protect places that are burdened by many different stressors that would have been missed if we just looked at one pollutant at a time. So to me, I think I saw in the process it like exceeding the max or exceeding the risk characterization threshold, or a disproportionate impact kind of like finding. Those would be things that clearly affect the decision. But maybe this is just a comment, but I would appreciate more clarity on how other parts, like the other indicators or the traffic analysis, for example, would affect the application decision. Thanks so much for all of this work.
Sure, thank you, Kevin. And in terms of the air dispersion modeling you mentioned, the air permit is addressing the air emissions, so there is a focus on that. And in terms of the traffic analysis, we're definitely going to have to do more research on how to characterize that, and potentially it could be incorporated into the dispersion modeling. Would be an ideal situation. And then I think for the other indicators, at this point, we're, as mentioned earlier, we're continuing to work on follow the research on how to add up stressors that are not air quality per se, but other impacts on a community. And at this point, that would be described and evaluated in the process, but it would be a qualitative review at this point. And we're certainly looking for suggestions and comments. And we appreciate the work that Union of Concerned Scientists have done in terms of characterizing a lot of the traffic emissions. We've seen some of the reports that have been done. And so any expertise on the transportation side or suggestions or comments, please do submit those.
Great, thank you. At this time, I am not seeing any additional comments from the chat or any hands raised.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to wrap up for the evening. I just want to review a few slides with everybody. Our next steps in the process are obviously going to be working on draft regulations. We talked about developing a risk assessment tool. We're working on that at this time. We have guidance pieces that we feel need to support the regulations we'll be working on. And of course, we'll be doing continued stakeholder input throughout the process. For opportunity for further input, we've done this before at our meetings. There will be, there's a link here, and we have another slide with that link as well, that for input, we use the SurveyMonkey device for input from this meeting. And this time we're doing it very generically because we didn't ask specific questions. We're asking for input on the whole framework. So we said we did post the framework on the website. And so we've asked for just input on the different sections of the framework, for instance, the applicability or the air quality analysis. So if you would like to either submit in writing some of your comments, please use the Survey Monkey, or if you would like to give us additional comments or additional input, you can use this mechanism. We appreciate all of the input that you can give us, or suggestions or comments, or for further ideas or suggestions. That would be terrific. We'd really appreciate it. And all the materials, the recorded meeting will be on our the air quality website at this location, as well as the slides and the framework. So for further information, we have, where you can submit comments in general, our distribution list for MEPA, as well as the DP CIA process, our website link, and the monkey survey monkey mechanism, the monkey. But anyway, is on one of the slides for your easy reference. So I think that is the last one. And also, lastly, when you leave the meeting, we do a quick survey. We appreciate if you would just give us some feedback on any comments you have on how the meeting was run, so that we can always improve and know if you found it effective, and have any comments on that as well. So again, we really thank you for participating this evening. We really appreciate your input. It's very helpful to get your feedback and to have this interaction. So we're just going to wait the meeting. We're basically ending the meeting now, and we're just going to wait a few minutes. As we're closing the meeting, we'll close the meeting in about a minute from now. But thank you very much. Have a good rest of your meeting. And thank you for participating.